So your dad starts getting up out of bed.
No, he wasn't. He was sleeping.
Okay. And you stabbed him.
Yep.
Do you remember how many times?
Countless.
I'm sorry?
Countless.
Countless times?
It was almost midnight in late August in Northport, Florida, when a woman's cries for help rang out across Malakote Road. She banged on a neighbor's door and rang the doorbell, screaming, "I need help! I need help!" By the time the neighbors awoke to investigate, she was gone, compelled off the street and back into her home by her killer. Police arrived to catch the suspect in flight, but unfortunately, for two of the street's most popular residents, it was already too late. Officers made a horrific discovery, the beginning of a story that would be hard to imagine were it not true. Today's case is about a selfless couple motivated by compassion and good intentions who made a choice that was met with betrayal, abuse, and rage. Northport sits quietly on Florida's Gulf Coast, a growing city of tree-lined streets, neighborhood cookouts, and the kind of easy community warmth that makes people put down roots and stay. It is not the kind of place where you expect to be woken up by screaming at midnight. It is not the kind of place where you expect to open your front door and find blood on the pavement. But on August 31st, 2023, the peace of Malakote Road was shattered in a way that its residents will never fully recover from. Jana Walton heard the commotion first. She opened her door to investigate the screaming, but the woman was gone. The street was quiet again. Something felt wrong enough that Janet checked a second time, and that second look reveals what the darkness had been hiding. Blood at the threshold of the house next door. A trail of it running down the driveway, pooling into the street. The kind of volume that told you immediately this was not an accident. This was not something minor. Officer Tyler Ragakis was among the first to arrive on scene. As he approached the property, he spotted a young man in a tank top and red shorts moving quickly toward a small black car parked nearby. Even in the darkness, even at distance, the officer could see that the man was covered in blood. Not a smear, not a stain, covered. What followed was a 30-minute pursuit that crossed county lines and reached speeds reckless enough to push the fleeing vehicle into oncoming traffic on the wrong side of the highway. The driver was not thinking about consequences. He was thinking about distance. He was thinking about escape. While that chase was still unfolding, the full horror of what had happened inside the house on Malakote Road was beginning to reveal itself to the officers who had stayed behind. Inside, they found Robbie and Jennifer Tower, both dead. The scene was one of extreme, almost incomprehensible violence. Blood across the bedroom, through the hallway, out the front door, and onto the street where Jennifer had made her final, desperate attempt to reach someone who could help her. Each of them had sustained a number of stab wounds that investigators would later describe with the kind of quiet, professional restraint that only barely conceals the shock underneath. The couple's 22-year-old son, Dima Tower, was absent from the home. The car chase ended when Dima abandoned his vehicle and fled on foot into a series of alligator-infested canals running through the darkness of the Florida night. For a few hours, he managed to stay hidden, moving through the water, through the reeds, through the kind of terrain that most people wouldn't enter in daylight. But his freedom was temporary. By the following morning, it was over. He was arrested at a gas station, still covered in mud, still covered in blood. To understand the full weight of what happened on Malakote Road, you have to understand who Robbie and Jennifer Tower were, not just as victims, as people. This is not simply a story about a murder. It is a story about what it costs to love without limits, about what happens when radical generosity meets something it cannot reach and cannot fix, and about two people who gave everything they had and paid for it with their lives. Robbie Tower was the kind of man that neighborhoods are built around. His neighbors had given him a nickname that tells you everything you need to know: the mayor of Malakote Road. He organized the block parties. He remembered everyone's birthdays. He was the first person to show up with a casserole when someone was sick, and the last to leave when someone needed company. His presence on that street was not incidental. It was foundational. Jennifer was equally remarkable in a quieter way. She worked as a paralegal during the week and taught Sunday school on weekends, a woman whose faith was not a performance or a social identity, but a genuine, lived commitment to the idea that love was an action you took, not a feeling you waited to have. Together, Robbie and Jennifer had built a full and meaningful life, but there was one absence they carried. They were unable to conceive a child of their own. And when they began to feel called to expand their family, they didn't look locally. Their faith had already taken them around the world on mission trips, into communities broken by poverty and neglect. They knew what suffering looked like in places that comfortable American life rarely required you to see. Their journey took them to an orphanage in Ukraine. Family members who mowed the trip with them later described the institution where they found Dima as a prison for children. The conditions were reportedly horrendous. Signs of physical abuse were visible. The children living there were not being raised, they were being warehoused, forgotten by a system that had decided they weren't worth the trouble. Robbie and Jennifer Tower looked at that place and made a decision that tells you exactly who they were. They brought Dima home. Dima was 14 years old when he arrived in Florida. He didn't speak English. He had grown up in an institution that had given him trauma instead of childhood. He had never experienced the rhythms of a family home, the ordinary negotiations and routines and warmth and friction that most children absorb so gradually they don't even notice it happening. The transition was, by every account, genuinely difficult, and the Towers knew it would be. They hadn't gone into this expecting ease. They had gone into it expecting to work, and they did. Dima enrolled in school. He began learning the language. The Towers documented every milestone with the undisguised joy of two people who had wanted this for a long time. When Dima became an American citizen, Robbie and Jennifer posted the photographs with the kind of pride that doesn't need a caption. It was written all over their faces. But as the years passed, the picture grew more complicated. The challenges that had seemed manageable when Dima was 14 became heavier as he moved through adolescence and into adulthood. Arguments became more frequent and more intense. The gap between the life the Towers had imagined and the reality of who Dima was becoming began to widen in ways that were difficult to bridge. By 2020, police had already been called to the home for a domestic incident, a warning sign that, in retrospect, casts a long shadow over everything that followed. By the summer of 2023, Dima had dropped out of school in the 10th grade. He wasn't working. He wasn't building toward anything. He had been living back under his parents' roof for 8 months, an arrangement that had become increasingly volatile. And in a gesture so painfully characteristic of who they were, Robbie and Jennifer had purchased Dima a car, the very car he would use on the night of August 31st to flee the scene of their murders. The forensic picture that emerged from the crime scene investigation was one that hardened investigators struggled to process. Robbie Tower had been stabbed 68 times. The majority of those wounds were inflicted while he was asleep in his bed, while he was entirely defenseless, entirely unaware, entirely trusting that he was safe in his own home. Jennifer had sustained 79 stab wounds. 79. The attack had begun in the bedroom and followed her out through the hallway, through the front door, down the driveway, and into the street, where she screamed for help until she could scream no more. The crime scene told a story of two people who had been attacked with a ferocity that went beyond any practical purpose. This was not the violence of someone trying to accomplish an objective. This was the violence of someone who had been carrying something enormous for a very long time and had finally put it down in the worst possible way. When Dima sat across from detectives the morning after his arrest, mud-caked, blood-stained, and remarkably composed, his explanation for what he had done was distilled into a single word: rage.
Well, something happened last night. Either you guys argued,
There's a lot of things that happen.
start the bedroom, the living room.
Yep.
Was your dad sleeping?
Yep.
Did you guys have a fight prior to this?
No.
He told investigators that Robbie and Jennifer were no longer his family, that the word meant nothing to him in the context of these two people who had traveled to another country specifically to give him one. He expressed contempt for the United States, the country that had granted him citizenship that he had posed for photographs celebrating. He said he wanted to return to Ukraine. And then he described, with a detachment that investigators found profoundly disturbing, exactly what he had done. He had thought about it before he walked into the house that night. He had sat in his car and considered it. He had gone to his room and drunk whiskey and let the decision solidify. Then he had walked to the kitchen, taken a knife from the butcher block, and gone to his father's bedroom. When the first knife slipped during the attack, when the handle became too slick with blood to maintain his grip, he did not stop. He did not reconsider. He did not feel anything that caused him to pause. He walked back to the kitchen. He selected a second knife, and he returned.
So your dad starts getting up out of bed.
No, he wasn't. He was sleeping.
Okay. And you stabbed him.
Yep.
Do you remember how many times?
Countless.
I'm sorry?
Countless.
Countless times. Did he ever get out of bed?
Yeah.
And then what? Did you push him against the wall? Or did he fall?
Dima Tower was indicted on 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. The trial took place in November 2025 and drew significant attention, not just because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the story wrapped around it. The story of a couple who had done everything right, who had opened their hearts and their home and their resources to a child the world had abandoned, and who had been killed by that child in their sleep. The defense attempted to reframe the murders as a crime of passion, arguing for a manslaughter characterization, suggesting that whatever happened that night was the product of an explosive, unplanned emotional rupture rather than deliberate, premeditated intent. Dima took the stand in his own defense. It did not go the way his attorneys had hoped. He was visibly agitated under questioning. He pushed back against the prosecutor's framing with a combativeness that read not as the defensiveness of an innocent man, but as the frustration of someone who felt that the proceedings were beneath him. He claimed temporary insanity, that he had not been in control of himself that night. But the details he provided in his own testimony told a different story entirely. He had planned it. He had sat in his car and decided. He had drunk whiskey and weighed. He had chosen his weapon deliberately, and when that weapon failed him, he had gone back for another. That is not temporary insanity. That is premeditation narrated by the perpetrator himself. The jury deliberated and returned guilty verdicts on both counts of first-degree premeditated murder. At sentencing, Robbie's father stood before the court and spoke with the raw, unfiltered grief of a man who had lost his son to someone his son had chosen to love. He asked Dima directly to never use the Tower family name again, to sever himself from it completely, because a name is the last thing a family has left to protect, and Dima Tower had forfeited any claim to it. Dima was given one final opportunity to address the court, one final moment to offer something, anything that acknowledged the magnitude of what he had taken from the world. He used that moment to blame his grandfathers for the way their children had been raised. The judge looked at him for a long moment before delivering the sentence. He called Dima an evil spirit, a phrase that landed in that courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. Then he imposed 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Robbie and Jennifer Tower are remembered on Malakote Road and far beyond it for the quality that defined every chapter of their lives, their selflessness. They spent their time, their money, and their energy traveling to broken places and trying to make them less broken. They held a deep and genuine love for the Ukrainian people that predated Dima's adoption and continued through every difficult year that followed it. They did not adopt a child because it was easy or fashionable or convenient. They did it because they saw a boy in a place that had given up on him, and they decided they had not. That is not naivete. That is not weakness. That is one of the finest things a human being can do. The tragedy of Robbie and Jennifer Tower is not simply that they were murdered. The tragedy is the specific, shattering irony at the center of it, that the very compassion that defined them, the very impulse toward love and rescue and open doors, is what placed them in the path of the person who killed them. They gave Dima Tower everything they had, and in the end, it wasn't enough to save them. But it was everything about who they were. And that, unlike the man who took their lives, is a legacy worth carrying forward. All details sourced from court records, trial testimony, and verified news reporting. Dima Tower was convicted in November 2025 and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without parole.